Thank you, and what better introduction into what we're about to do by praising the holy name of Jesus. I really hope, and this is my prayer, that if I've come from Rome to be with you here today, it's so that we can lift this name high. And I know that you've been working hard, talking science today, and learning a lot from that perspective about what we can know about the man of the shroud from science, from our microscopes. And we said we were always going to look with two sets of eyes, remember? The eyes of a pilgrim and the eyes of a scientist. And so now we need to finish the passion and get all the way through the cross, through death, into resurrection. And I hope I can do justice to this lofty theme, but know this, that the climax of tonight isn't what happens on the stage, but when we set up the altar up here and we come into contact, into Holy Communion with our Lord at the Mass. And so I hope this can be a preparation for receiving Him sacramentally. All right, so if you remember where we were moving through the Passion, and we had just gotten through those preambles. And I challenge you to look not just to ask, what did He suffer, but why did He suffer it? And this we need a theological vision. So the scourging at the pillar is not like what you saw in the Passion of the Christ. Mel Gibson was interviewed and he said, look, I want to elicit an emotional response. I want to drive you over the edge. I want you to consider just how much he suffered, but don't think this was a historical representation. The scorpione, which would have left him absolutely deprived of his own blood, and no way he could have survived such a thing. What you see on the shroud, however, is much more credible. This was already explained to some extent as far as the number of signs and scourgings. I just want to highlight some of the biblical data. Do you know that scientists count somewhere around 360 is where John Jackson, for example, puts the number of scourge marks. If you have 3 lashes, three leather straps tied to one handle, we're talking 120 lashes. Think of this. In Deuteronomy, it says that you're not to scourge beyond 40 lashes. This is why the Jews set it at 39. Remember Paul in 2 Corinthians 11 enumerates all those sufferings, and he says, 5 times I received the 40 lashes minus 1. Because the Old Testament said, should you exceed that number, you're treating a man as a beast. Well, how are they treating Jesus? Remember, this is not a Jewish flogging. This is a Roman scourging. You know, Jews use leather straps. Here you have lead balls. Each of those marks is the equivalent of a 3rd-degree burn as far as the damage that it does to the body. And it's all over. Barry mentioned how it's head to toe, and not the face and not the forearms, but the front and the back. I assumed it was just the back he was scourged, but we know this as well. The wounds in the pelvic region are just as deep as everywhere else in the body. There was no protective loincloth in the moment of scourging. He was publicly humiliated in this way. He was stripped of his dignity, right? This is the point. And yet, what's the irony if you look with biblical eyes? That Jesus, in this very moment, is clothing us with divine dignity, isn't it? This is what, in theology, we call recapitulation. Have you heard this term? It comes from St. Paul. The taking under one head. Jesus sums it all up. Adam, the first Adam, in his disobedience, ties a knot. And Jesus enters into that knot, and with his obedience, unties it. So remember, Adam was naked without shame in Genesis 2:24. Did you notice that passage in the Genesis? In the original Eden, they were naked, but there was no shame about nakedness. Everything God created is good. But the effect of sin was this. They hid themselves. They felt ashamed. Jesus is dealing with the effects of the first man's sin by entering into the knot and from within untying it. But at what a cost, right? So this is why I say we have to look with a microscope to understand how much he received. But we have to get to the Bible to answer the question, and what does it mean? what was the weight that Christ was carrying? These are just some images that show a reconstruction of the back. I think I skipped over it. Let me back it up a second. Clicker wants to obey. Let's see. More. It's a little slow. Okay, I'll use this slide. It's just to show that there's a directionality, there's a rhyme and a reason. There's a method to the madness here, but we never noticed it until somebody took the time to draw a circle around every single scourge mark. And what they notice is that those wounds that land towards the mid-range of the body are perpendicular to the main axis. But if you look towards the feet and towards the head, they always fall at an oblique angle. So what we can understand is that there's two men scourging, one on the right, one on the left, and they're pivoting. They're standing still but rotating around a central point. And so the arc of one man is evidently longer than the other because, well, I guess he's taller than the other guy. These are details that we could discern in the 1970s, but nobody picked it up before then. Again, on the theory that this is made by an artist, well, he was so clever that nobody even noticed it until centuries later, apparently. These are one of the good reasons for authenticity, I think. All right, I want to move on to the crowning with thorns, because if I had to pick a single element that points to authenticity, it'd be this. And I already mentioned that only Jesus, as far as a study of history goes, he's the only one we know that was both crowned and crucified. And that's what we find on the shroud as well. So who else could it be? Is kind of the question. By the way, there have been studies by mathematicians who actually measure that probability. I can't remember if the most conservative estimates put it at 1 out of 83 million or something like this, to say it's virtually sure. But look to this crown of thorns. Barry mentioned this already, that you typically see it depicted in this way, don't you, where the top of the head is left exposed. That's what a forger would have been inclined to paint, because that's what is enshrined in our tradition, isn't it? And yet the shroud dares to depart from this and gives us a helmet of thorn, because we have over 30 or 50 puncture wounds that cover this whole area of the head. By the way, some of the highest concentration of blood vessels is gathered right up here. So you'd expect a large accumulation of blood at the nape of the neck, and that's exactly what you find if you find this is a reconstruction that shows how what was likely to be used was a pliant branch of sorts that bound together this messy batch of thorn and then just plopped on the head. The Sisyphus spina Christi, the Latin name, actually means thorns of Christ. Could it be that some remembered this to be the species that was used for, species of plant to be used for the making of the crown? That we don't know, but those thorns are 3/4 of an inch long, and they might be supple when they're green, but once they harden, and they dry, they're hard as nails. And so many forensic doctors suggest that those thorns pierce not just through the skin, but all the way to the bony plate below. So think of that. And it's not just that he bore the weight of the thorns, but if it's true, what tradition remembers, if you go to Jerusalem, you'll see X marks the spot. He fell here, he fell here, he fell here. 3 times he fell. This, by the way, is not mentioned in Scripture. You prayed in the Stations of the Cross. He fell a first time, a second time, and a third time, right? Well, just a holy tradition, right? A pious practice. But is there any evidence of it? What we find on the shroud is that there is soil at the base of the feet, at the right knee, and guess what? At the tip of the nose. If his hands were tied, because remember, he's crucified with a man on the right and the left, it's likely that these 3 victims were marched through the city together in such a way that they're tied together like as on a chain gang. Here we can only speculate, but it's likely that the victim wasn't allowed to just drop the beam and run off into the city. If his arms are attached, it means his hands are free to brace himself when he's inclined to fall. And so he comes crashing to the ground, and that means 57 to 75 kilograms of wood come crashing down on a crown of thorns. That soil, by the way, that's collected from the feet, knee, and nose, is soil we can place under a microscope. We can tell you its chemical composition is calcium carbonate with just a touch of strontium. We know also that its crystalline structure is very rare. It's travertine aragonite. According to one geologist, it matches the soil of the grottos of Jerusalem like a fingerprint. Again, if it's manufactured in France in the 1300s, what's it doing with Palestinian soil there? Again, this is as far as science can go. These kinds of reflections. I want to take it a big step deeper as we, take off our lab coat and put on the eyes of a pilgrim for a moment and ask, why a crown of thorns? Have you ever thought deeply about this? In the scriptures, it's half a sentence. It's relegated to a subordinate clause. And after he was crowned, they marched him off to be crucified. That's about all you get. Think deeply about the symbolism here. Jesus is a king. And yet they're mocking that confession, aren't they? Oh, kings need a crown. Here you go, Jesus. And yet it's mock worship. They don't really think him a king. And yet this is the King of Kings who knew exactly what kind of crown he should wear. This is the blood stain that's gathered at the nape of the neck. See how it flows down towards the center? And scientists all notice something very, very unique here. We can distinguish, that is, blood that flows out of the frontal vein from blood that flows out of an artery. Did they know that in the Middle Ages? Have you ever seen sketches of the circulatory system from that time? It's funnier than a comic strip. They didn't know anything about this. The musculature around an artery and how that compares and contrasts from a vein. How pressure is greater at an artery because the heart is pumping away. No, they didn't know these things, and yet the shroud records something very credible from a scientific point of view. This is venous blood right here. Okay, but what of this crown? This is where we got to go to the scriptures. All right, I'm going to ask for your help here. Where's the first time in the scriptures where we get a reference to thorn? Anybody have a thought there? Think of this. The original garden paradise in the chapters 1 and 2 of Genesis. Fruit of every kind. Every fruit-bearing tree is there. Any thorns? No. Until Adam's sin. Right? Do you remember what Yahweh, the Lord God, punishes the serpent and Eve? And then he comes to Adam. And think of this. The punishment is, cursed be the ground because of you. Did you ever stop to think about the cosmic effects of man's sin? The ground is to be cursed. Thorns and thistles shall it bear forth, and only by the sweat of your brow shall it bring forth food, etc. So thorns and thistles are the consequence of sin and become the symbol of sin from that page onward. And you could read several passages like this in the Old Testament, but what's most striking is that in Jesus' first homily, in Matthew chapter 7, he uses that exact same phrase, thorns and thistles. And if you look to the Greek, it's literally the exact same vocabulary. Thorns and thistles. When does Jesus speak of thorns and thistles? What is he talking about? He's talking about the false prophets. Beware of false prophets. They're like wolves in sheep clothing. Well, great, Jesus. If they're like wolves in sheep's clothing, how am I going to pick them out in a crowd? And Jesus says, you'll know them by their fruit. Are grapes gathered from thorns or figs from thistles? And this is his question. And so you got to ask, what, is Jesus really interested in agriculture here? What are we talking about? Figs and thorns and thistles and grapes? And it's a metaphor for moral good. That's the fruit that we want, the good fruit that reveals a good tree. What's the bad fruit that reveals a bad tree? He uses this image of thorns and thistles, but he's talking about moral evil. He's talking about sin. Just like Genesis, the consequence of sin. So put 2 and 2 together here and look at this. Jesus, without even opening his mouth, but simply by wearing a crown of thorns on his head, is saying, I am the sin bearer. Isn't that what John the Baptist said on page 1 of the Gospel? Behold the Lamb of God, who takes away the sins of the world. The Lamb of God. Now that's a weird thing to say, isn't it? Why is he calling somebody a lamb? We've heard it so many times, we forget to think about it. We ponder it too little. What if you were a Jew and you knew Genesis 22? You remembered the story of Abraham. Abraham is our father in the faith, of course. But remember, he's got this promise from God that he's going to have descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and yet he's got, according to the covenant, one kid, Isaac. Isaac, he's supposed to offer up as a holocaust, a sin offering. How is that supposed to work? Abraham has no idea, but he trusts God anyway in this test of faith, and he marches up Mount Moriah, and as the only beloved son is carrying the wood of the sacrifice up the mountain, he says, "Hey, Dad, here's the wood. Where's the lamb?" By the way, just in case you thought this was a little boy of 4 years old, he's carrying the wood of the sacrifice. Go to the rabbinical tradition. It's the Jews that remember Isaac to be 33 years old when he's carrying the wood of the sacrifice up Mount Moriah. Abraham says, God will provide the lamb. But if you remember the story, God didn't provide a lamb that day, because in the very moment the knife was about to fall, the angel comes to stay the hand of his father and says, "Now that I know that you fear God, do no harm to him." This is when Abraham wheels about and sees a ram, not a lamb, a ram with its horns caught in a thicket. I love that part. Think of that. The head of this vicarious victim is wrapped in thorn. See, we're used to comparing Isaac to Jesus, but have you ever stopped to think about the typological relationship between the ram and the son who was not spared? Think of this. What does it mean to have your horns wrapped in a thicket? If you're a ram and another ram comes charging at you, how do you defend yourself if not by your horns? Isn't that exactly what they're asking Jesus to do? Look, you saved others, save yourself, come down, show us your power, and then we'll believe in you. In other words, show us your horns, Jesus. Flex your muscle. Jesus, you want to see power? I'll show you power. I will die, and on the third day rise. How about that? Just like I said I would. But for the time being, my horns are wrapped in a thicket. In other words, I am going not to ward off death by a backwards blow. Instead, I'll receive that blow. I'll let all of the power of Satan, all the powers of darkness, in one moment are concentrated in one place. And they let out all their power, and guess what? It proves to be utterly ineffectual. And this is why St. Paul can say, "Oh, death, where is your sting?" I love it. Paul is trash-talking death. He's like, you got nothing. You let out everything, you unleashed your best shot, and it's utterly useless. Because why? You can't put life to death. Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." And even though he endured a natural death, that is his human soul separated from his human body, he always lived. So much so that eventually those two principles were brought back together in the resurrected life. And so Jesus lives again to show that death is utterly defeated once and forever. But death is just the consequence of sin. So what does that show? If death has been conquered, that sin has been defeated. This is why everything we believe as Christians is founded upon resurrection of Jesus. Now I believe looking at the crown, not just with the eyes of a scientist, but with the eyes of Christian faith, allows you to reveal, or perceive rather, the nature of the kingdom. The kingdom of heaven, as it's made manifest on earth. It's not a contradiction. Jesus is manifesting, not hiding what it means to be the divine love. Jesus manifested through the cross. So if other kings wear a crown of gold, if they lord it over their subjects to show their power, Jesus turns that paradigm right upside down and says, "I am the good shepherd who lays down my life for the good of the sheep." It's poignant that the crown be a crown of thorns, because the kingdom of heaven is upside down when judged against the kingdoms of this world. Right? So this is why I say, don't be ashamed of the faith that's been revealed by God, because it gives you a wisdom and insight that it goes far beyond what the microscope can perceive. All right, I'm going to keep going. Jesus carries the cross, and of course we see signs of this on the shroud, but it's not the T-cross that would have weighed over 300 pounds. It's the patibulum, that's the horizontal beam that weighs about 100 pounds, give or take 25. Or as I said earlier, in kilograms, 57 to 75. Now, look how he's tied. We don't know if that's, in fact, what the man of the cross endured during his travel to Mount Calvary. But what we do see on the shroud is that there are two excoriations, one on the right shoulder, and then one on the left shoulder blade, further down and closer to the spine. And it's a larger excoriation. Now, it's interesting to know that men who work on the railroad work in just this way. A third of the weight is in front of them, 2/3 is behind. So if you fall or if you stumble, guess where it would be inclined to strike the left side, further down, and just where the shoulder blade sticks out, as the shroud records. Now, this again is after hematodrosis, after the blows, after being denied water and breakfast, and then scourging, and then stripping him and putting the red cloth on and taking that off and putting his own cloths back on. Think of the aggravation to all of those wounds. And then just further intensifies these sufferings. All right, now the weight of the cross is, of course, much heavier than 100 pounds. He's carrying the weight of all the sins of all the world from the dawn of time till the end of the age. How much does that weigh? Right? This is just the image of that. So don't stop on a very human reflection that simply says, how much does wood weigh? Realize what this is symbolizing, because that's the deeper reality. That's the heavier load. And that's real too. Okay. All right, let's move forward to crucifixion, because this is the last stage in the sorrowful mysteries. Jesus dies on the cross. Now, I want to highlight the moment of nailing, and then we'll settle in on death in just a moment. But the first thing to notice is just the position of this nail. I want to speak to this now from a biblical perspective, because Barry already mentioned how the surprise that you see on the shroud is that it's not in the center of the palms, remember? And there's a good reason that couldn't have been the place. Pierre Barbet writes about this in A Doctor at Calvary. This is a French surgeon who in the 1930s does some experiments on fresh cadavers, and then in the 1950s publishes his work. He tells you how if you hang half the weight of a human body on the arm that is attached to a nail in the center of the palm, not even 10 minutes will it last. Because there's simply no transversal support here. There's no bones and there's no way that it could sustain the weight of the body. Instead, what you read on the shroud is something much more credible. Pierre Barbet is afraid, though, of putting the nail there on his fresh experiments. Why? Because he says, it says in the scripture that not a bone shall be broken. Remember, it's John the Evangelist who quotes Exodus 16 there in reference to what? The Passover lamb, exactly. So the evangelist reads this element as a fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy, as it were, that Jesus is now showing himself to be the Paschal lamb. So his bones shouldn't be broken. Are you going to tell me a 9-inch nail with a square cross-section going through there isn't going to chip a little something? Pierre Barbet doesn't know. He gives it a try. In every instance, it opens what he calls an anatomical path. These bones reconfigure around the nail, and now they're fastened very securely. Now we know from the literature you could last days, even weeks, on the cross. Barry spoke about different variants of crucifixion where the nails went in sideways through the ankles. There was also, sometimes they were introduced a little triangle under your feet, a little sedile, a seat, so that it would redistribute the weight and allow you to breathe more easily. You're not bleeding so much so long as we don't unplug the nails. That's when the blood flows. But so long as that faucet is tapped, as it were, you don't die by bleeding. Okay, so what do you die of? By asphyxiation. right? There are a number of features, but this is the most prominent perhaps, because you know how there's an envelope, it's called a pleural cavity. There's a double envelope around your lungs and heart. Well, it's filling with body fluid as you're hanging there. Men, if they don't have some support under the feet or some way of rising up, and they're just hanging there, after 10 or 12 minutes, you'll go unconscious. You have to breathe. So you'll kick the air if you have to, but Jesus gets a nail in the feet that allows him to rise up and exhale. Because now he can watch this movement. When you breathe in, when you breathe out, see how I relax as I collapse? What if my hands are pinned high? Well, now these intercostal muscles are forced into a certain position. And the only way I can relax is by pulling on the nails in my hands, pressing down on the nail through my feet, and that's sending shock waves of pain through the central nervous system, of course, because these nerves right here where that nail passes through, the ulnar nerve, the median nerve, they're not just motor nerves that control the movement of the digits, they're sense nerves. And that means the pain is like exploding in his brain for 3.5, 4.5, 6 hours. It's hard to know exactly how long Jesus was on the cross. It says he was crucified at 9 a.m. in Mark's gospel. In John's gospel, though, he's in front of Pontius Pilate at the 6th hour. That means 12 noon. Now remember, they didn't have, Timex watches back then. They did have 3-hour shifts, though. So if it's 10:30 and Jesus is crucified at that time, one would be just as equally inclined to say the 3rd hour, 9 a.m., or the 6th hour, 12 noon. So sometime in that window, Jesus is put to the cross. Remember, there's darkness over the land from 12 to 3. Then he lets out a loud cry at some point and dies. Can you imagine at least 3 hours? And I couldn't last 12 minutes. But the nail it's probably like this. Do you see how the stipes is this vertical piece that's already planted in the ground? Remember, along the Via Appia, some 6,000 were crucified at a single time. Can you imagine how expert these men were at doing this? There's no reason to build a 30-foot scaffolding to raise Jesus high in the sky. It's enough that he's 6 inches off the ground. That would do the job just the same. So the vertical piece has a fixture ready to receive the horizontal piece. And then he sags from 90 degrees, some 25 degrees. And all of the weight of the wood is, imagine standing up, and then you can't even lean forward. Why? You got a crown of thorns on your head. And it's not until they plop you up and set you down and drive a nail through your feet, that you can rise up and redistribute that weight. All right. So I mention this again, just to say, what did those hands ever do except feed the hungry, heal the sick, restore the sight to the blind man? Look what we do to them. This was the reflection of Sainte Thérèse de Lisieux. She was contemplating the cross and she saw the blood trickling from Christ's wounds. And she said, I want to gather it up. I don't want it to fall in vain. You see, there's a whole different order of this kind of reflection. It's not just to say, was it in destot space or Z space in the metacarpals where the nail was driven? Our reflections have got to go deeper than that. This is the blood that is shed by the Savior for a purpose. And again, we see it so much, but we contemplate it so little. I hope that changes a little with today's reflections. All right. See this bifurcation pattern? See this 5 to 7 degree difference? That proves that he's twisting around that nail. Gravity isn't changing. The blood drips down every single time. But down has a different orientation according to the position of the hand, right? So he's twisting. Again, this is true of all of the blood that's already flowed from the wound. Somebody remind me, is it 12 more minutes? Is that right? No. Is that, sorry? Okay. So I want to keep moving because this is where the nail is in the feet. At least, it's hard to know both feet because remember, we only see one planted there securely. This shows the 2 positions. Do you see how he's low here? I'll put it in the center so all can see. He's sagging, but that's going to mean that his lungs are under pressure. His heart is also, with every breath, it's getting harder for that heart to pump. And he has to rise up so that he can breathe out. But that takes tremendous energy, and so he's going to have to fall back into a position. But there is no relief in either position. It's just redistributing the pain. Do you think of this? I think it's World War II, there were soldiers who had an exposed median nerve that could get no morphine. Some preferred to commit suicide than to endure the pains. There's a word for this. In English, we speak of excruciating pain. I'm not sure if you've ever stopped to think about that word. But you know that it comes from ex cruce, cruciatus, out of the cross. Right? So there's a pain that is so powerful, so unique, it gets its own word. This is what Jesus is experiencing. This is what he endures quite willingly. So that'll put new perspective on those talks that you hear on Good Friday where Jesus speaks 7 times from the cross. I can assure you that if I were up there on the cross, I wouldn't have said a word. Right? It's all I could do to breathe. And Jesus speaks 7 times. And look at this. The one you get from Luke at the start there, chapter 23, is, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. Think of that. He's praying for the men who are torturing him in the very moment of his deepest agony. Contrary to every fiber in our being, I think, isn't it? When we suffer, we focus in on ourselves. Do we love others to such a degree that we're praying for them? Father, forgive them. Do you know that the Greek says, not he said, but elegen. That's the imperfect. It means he was saying, Father, forgive them. Father, forgive them. They know not what. Again and again and again, probably. Something he repeated. And then, just if you thought you were figuring out a little bit more about the sufferings of Christ on the cross, he goes and throws a curveball at us by saying, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? So this is mysterious, right? How is it possible that the Son of God, the one who is consubstantial with the Father, could say, why have you forsaken me? Why have you abandoned me? What, is Jesus somehow separated from the Father? No, he's entering into solidarity with sinners so much that he can say, from our perspective, look at where I am. I love that Psalm 139 that says, if I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. Right? Where? It's impossible. But Jesus is experiencing the effects. Remember, he has not a single sin of his own. And yet he's entering into our condition so profoundly that this is what he prays. I can't begin to explain that verse to you. Except there's an invitation, though, there to say, there is a darkness that Jesus willingly steps into so that we could enjoy the light. And I think we haven't valued his gift enough. I haven't valued his gift enough. But I know that he's calling me to try, at least. I want to press onward to an important theme, which is the death and resurrection. Obviously, there is no resurrection without death, so we have to start with first things first. Do we know that Jesus actually died? That is, from the shroud, can we prove that that man suffered all the way unto death? Maybe he just was brought to the brink of death, and then they nursed him back to full health. Is that possible? No, it's not. According to the Medical Association, if you want to read an article about this, check out the JAMA article, J-A-M-A. And that brings together all of the medical evidence, but one of the most important clues, of course, is the wound to the side. It's between the 5th and 6th rib. We're talking a distance of 10 centimeters to the heart. If you don't have a traumatic surgeon standing by within 2 or 3 minutes, you can guarantee death. Now, in this case, we actually know he's already dead, even before the wound was inflicted. How do we know? I want to show you in this next slide, that the Romans were expert at delivering the coup de grace, right? This was meant to be a mortal blow. If you had your sword, you would wield it in the right hand. But if you're looking for distance, you save your shield for your strong arm and jab with the left. so that you would hit the right. Okay? Now, the dying Gaul, this is 200 years before Christ, it's in the Capitoline Museums in Rome. He's contemplating his own death. If you look closely, there's a wound in the exact same spot as we see it on the shroud, between the 5th and 6th rib. Proof that the Romans were expert at aiming at this spot and inflicting a wound that has a double-edged blade, and I'm going to show you the evidence of this right here. So let me back that up. There's the wound. This is where the blade would enter. Do you see this 4 centimeter? That black spot is where the blade enters and cuts left and right. Now, when you read the evangelist in John, he says, out flowed what? Good, you guys know your gospels, your blood and water. Now this is interesting, right? Because now the scientists are studying this. Well, we can see blood with the naked eye, but you can't see water with the naked eye, unfortunately. But think of stirp. They're not looking with the naked eye anymore. So when they do ultraviolet fluorescence, that is, they turn out the lights and then they flash on UV, and then they capture what fluoresces, look at what comes back. What comes back is this halo. You can even see it out here. Now it's going to be impossible for me to show you that which is ultraviolet, that is what is beyond visible violet, but there's something of a glow. My goodness. He's got a mind of his own. There's a glow around that, and that proves that what we have here is separated blood, post-mortem blood. So the heart is about the size of a clenched fist. So when the heart is pumping, well, then you've got mixed blood that's circulating through the system, right? But what happens if the heart stops? The heavy pieces, platelets and red blood vessels, they settle to the bottom. But it's the plasma, it's the serum that rises to the top. This watery substance. So if he's already dead 30 minutes or 60 minutes, that blood is completely separated, such that the red part's at the bottom and the watery part's at the top. So if that was pierced, out would flow what could easily be described as blood and water. We couldn't see any of this until the 1970s. So unlike the other blood elsewhere, which was shed during life, this is post-mortem blood. So for those who would argue that Jesus swooned and then was nursed back to health, and then they perpetrated this lie of resurrection after the fact, I'm sorry, that theory just does not hold water. Oh, that wasn't meant to be a pun, sorry. So, signs of resurrection. Signs of resurrection. This is important. Now, we've touched on this earlier today, haven't we? What is the kind of evidence that we have of resurrection? Empirical evidence? Logical proof? Do we reach it by way of syllogism? Do you have to be an Einstein to be a Christian? No. Resurrection is a dogma of faith that you give assent to by virtue of the fact of the one who reveals it, right? Let me give you an example of this. Let's see. I've never been to Andromeda, the galaxy next door, right? I believe that it's there. Why? Because good scientists tell me so, right? I believe in Australia, for crying out loud. I've never been there, but I have good evidence for it, right? So I have natural faith that those maps and those Australians tell me the truth about this distant land that I've never been to. I don't have first-hand knowledge of it, I have second-hand knowledge of it. Well, that's what faith is like, except that it's not a NASA scientist I'm putting my trust in. It's God himself, when he reveals himself through his word. Okay, so that's reasonable to do in 1,000 natural ways, and it's reasonable to do if the witness shows himself to be credible. Now that's what I think we've got here. Not proof of resurrection, signs of resurrection. A proof is such that that which derives from it is necessary. But a sign points to what's possible, what's plausible, what could be the case. Okay? So what I think is that we have signs, and I want to point to a couple. Now it's obvious that the shroud is an unicum, it's one of its kind. It's this photo document where the grayscale is inverted. It contains three-dimensional information unlike any other cloth. It's an enigma as to how the image is formed. Yes, that's one of the elements to consider with regard to the question of the resurrection. But beyond that, we should consider rigor mortis. Barry already mentioned some of these. This is perhaps most clear, I think, in the buttocks, in the thighs. They're curved, they're not pressed like soft tissue against the window pane that's pressed flat. That curvature proves that he's rock solid, even as he's lying on a flat surface, right? Okay, also, why is the chin so close to the sternum? Not because there's a pillow under his head, but because that's the position he was in on the cross. And now he's maintaining that position even though he's lying in the horizontal position, okay? Especially when one is exerting oneself physically, rigor mortis sets in right away and strongly. But it doesn't last forever. All right, well, how long does it last? 40 hours. That at 40 hours after death, rigor mortis relaxes. The body begins to decompose and putrefy. And yet there are no signs of putrefaction, of decomposition on the shroud. You would expect ammonia gas to exit out of the oral and nasal passages, and that would have obscured the facial image, but that didn't take place. This is exactly what Psalm 16 says, in which Peter quotes on Pentecost Sunday in Acts chapter 2. You shall not let your beloved see corruption. He shall not endure the pit, right? That is to say, the powers of death will not conquer Christ. And this is shown in the fact that in the grave, the body wouldn't decompose. This is an ancient psalm from the times of David that is now attributed to Jesus in the new era, the first Christians. Acts chapter 2, Psalm 16. I think that's fascinating. That's fascinating to think about. That the body could, yes, he could die a natural death. Yes, his physical, his soul, his human soul could be separated from his human body. And yet the divinity could never be divorced from the humanity. Why? Because that is a consubstantial, there is a hypostatic union there. This is the big words of theology, right? But it's powerful to think about. You cannot separate that which God has united. Divinity has joined humanity in the incarnation. And this harkens back to our first question, which we started with today. What is the relationship between divinity and humanity? What's the interplay between heaven and earth, between grace and nature? Are they competitive realms that are mutually exclusive? No. The humanity of Christ participates in his divinity. It reveals his divinity. You don't look to Christ and be like, oh, let me shut my eyes because I want to see the invisible truth of who he is. No, you open your eyes because by looking at his broken humanity on the cross is precisely when you see best the power of divine love. This is the great mystery that's revealed. All right, so rigor mortis is not relaxed. This is signs that putrefaction has not set in, decomposition has not begun. This fulfills the scriptures. All right, I want to move to this bloodstain now. Think of this. This blood is dried blood. It's coagulated, and then it needs to soften in the tomb, and once liquefied anew, it can now pass from the cadaver to the cloth, right? Hardened blood can't do that. And so this process of the protein that hardens the blood, it's called fibrin. Well, when it's dissolved, then that's a ticking clock. We can measure this. This is precisely what forensic doctors do. They compare this blood stain to that. They measure how long would it take for such a blood stain to pass from the body to the cloth. And you know what they say? 30 to 36 hours. That's when fibrinolysis was interrupted. That's when the cloth was separated from the body. If you want to just do the simple math with me, we're talking if Jesus is laid in the tomb at 6 p.m. on Friday, let's say, before the Sabbath sets in, 30 hours later is midnight. 6 a.m. would be 36 hours later. Now we're talking Easter Sunday, somewhere between midnight and 6 a.m. apparently, there is a separation of the cloth from the body. Okay? Now, the other element that some have mentioned, though not all agree, is that if you look to the boundaries of this blood stain, you will find no smearing, no smudging. Not even at a microscopic level do we see signs of what you might see if you were to look at a Band-Aid after you wrench it off. right? I always hate this part. I always got to count to 3, right? It's like, I know I'm going to take off more than just the Band-Aid. A little bit of me is going with it. So here we go. 1, 2. Look back to the Band-Aid and you'll see signs of human violence, human intervention. This is what we don't see on the shroud. Now again, some debate the point. Some say, no, I think you could take off the cloth without leaving signs. Maybe. But if it's true that the blood is hardened and then softening in the tomb, it seems that it's forming some sort of paste between cloth and body. And the separation isn't going to show any signs? Really? I don't know. I have my doubts. But I go back to the place where we started, John chapter 20. Let's see if anybody remembers what was said there. Remember, we got 3 verses, each of which use that word othonia, that is linen cloths, 3 times. And we said John saw it from the outside, Peter saw it from close up, and then John enters and says, he saw and believed. The one little detail, the one description we get of this cloth is that it's lying there. You're like, great, Father Andrew, that helps a lot. It's lying there, big deal. This little participle could be interpreted to mean, not that it's lying on the ground, as some mistranslate, but his point isn't, it's not lying on the stairs, it's not lying on the sill, it's lying on the ground. No, it says lying there, that's it. Some interpret this verb to mean it's lying flat. Let me explain with a metaphor, okay? So I had Tim Hortons ham and cheese sandwich for lunch today, so I'll use that. So imagine I have a leftover, as I do actually in my backpack, a leftover half. Now if you really like your ham sandwich, you might be inclined to wrap it in plastic wrap, put it in the fridge, and if you really are afraid your sister might eat it before you get a chance, you might put a padlock on the fridge, right? And now you can go away for the weekend. What happens if you come back on Sunday morning and you see the fridge door blown open, it's the padlock that's lying on the ground, you open the drawer where you left your sandwich, and lo and behold, there's the plastic wrap in the exact same position and orientation as you left it on Friday night, but lo and behold, no sandwich, right? What if the saran wrap is just lying there? What if it's like a balloon that's lost all its air? What if John had wrapped the body on Friday night and he came back on Sunday morning and he saw that the contents were no longer contained inside? Maybe that's why he said he saw and believed. Now again, I can't prove it to you, but it does seem to make sense from the data that is actually given. So some scientists, by the way, not looking at all at the scriptures, but simply looking at the image of the body, have postulated what's called a cloth collapse theory. Now, I'm not sure if this is right, I'll be honest with you, I don't know. But some think that the body dematerialized, and that the body converted in some sort of light, and that some sort of light effect was responsible for the image on the shroud. Again, this is not a scientific observation we're making now. This is speculation that would seem to concord with the different data that we have. Now, I want to touch this question about resurrection and naturalistic explanations of it, because we had a question about it at the last session. Do we believe in the resurrection because we have scientific proof that some fireworks are responsible for the image of the body? No, thank you. Because even if we could explain by naturalistic means alone, that is, without appeal to any supernatural intervention, no miracle, but if it's just a matter of some natural phenomenon that caused the image of the shroud, well then, where is there room for an acknowledgement that God has acted in a special way in the world? All right, what is a miracle, if not when God, against the natural laws that we're always observing every single day, intervenes in a special way, right? It's a supernatural intervention that takes place whenever there's a miracle, not a natural one. So this is where science meets its limit. A scientist can simply say, I don't know what's responsible for the effect that I see. I know it's not a rubbing, I know it's not a scorch, I know it's not a camera oscura, and I know it's not a painting. What I can't tell you is what it is. So as a scientist, what can I say? That's it, right? And the scientist simply stops. But you and I are all men and women. We're not just scientists. And so we have to construe according to our wits and not just to one discipline, right? And so you simply have to ask the question, what do you think is more likely? Do you think it's more likely that God rose Jesus from the dead? And that this supernatural intervention, however it took place, whatever it looked like, is responsible for the image that we have? Perhaps. Personally, I'm inclined to think that the shroud is not a miracle. Can I say that again? I don't think the shroud is a miracle. I think the resurrection is a miracle. And I think the shroud is the natural effect of that supernatural event. But again, I can't prove it, and I'm not going to impose that vision on anyone else. And I just want to say this, that I'm so happy to share the platform here today with Barry Schwartz, who has a very different vision, but I think a very respectable position. That is to say, I am no one to point a finger at the unbeliever to say, why don't you believe? How silly, how foolish. Because there is nothing on the shroud, there's nothing we can measure that says proof of resurrection. It's simply not there. We can only say this is compatible with that which God revealed. Now, I think there are great arguments for resurrection on a historical basis, and I wish we had another chance to meet and we could talk about that. But I'll only say this quickly, that you know a generation ago, the scientific community, that is those who publish on this area in the guild, in the professional guild of Biblical Theology and Exegesis, 40 years ago is a very different landscape. Nowadays, the consensus view among the skeptics, mind you, is this, that no matter what we say took place in history, we have to affirm historically that the early Christians believed in the resurrection. Okay? So there was an empty tomb. He died, he was buried, and then they discovered an empty tomb, and by golly, this generation believed that he rose. What now you have to do as a historian is ask, what accommodates that data? Think of it, the whole community of Jews that became Christians transferred their holy day from Saturday to Sunday. They went to their death believing this, that Jesus actually rose. The central premise of Christianity, that Christ rose from the dead, came into a world that knew that resurrections don't take place. And yet, despite that going against the grain, whole sectors of society were converted, and look where we are today. If the resurrection were not a supernatural kind of event, it would be the most indisputable event of ancient history. The best attested in the ancient world by far. And so I invite you to check out, if you're interested in this kind of thing, a talk by Gary Habermas, who talks about the resurrection and the historical argument that is made today with the help of theologians like N.T. Wright and others. I know it's time to close, and so I'll leave you with a song. I know I've given you a lot of data to contemplate. This is just a couple minutes, but it's one of my confreres by the name of Father Stephen Howe, who came to a Shroud tour in our exhibit there in Rome, and he went home, I'm so pleased, and he wrote this beautiful ballad, which is now a contemplation of the face of Jesus. And I hope that you enjoy it. I hope it aids your prayer.
Who is this man I hardly see, shrouded in silence, speaking to me? Why is his story told in blood and light? What did our God stoop down to write? What will I let him bring to light? I see the nails, I see the blood, my tears go forth in a cleansing flood. Why did my Savior choose these chains for me? oppressed and abused, rejected, used, falsely accused. I see his eyes, I see them close. I hear his words spoken in death's throes. Father, forgive them, they don't know what they do. What can I say, Lord, but I love you? I love you, Lord, wanna be like you. I see his eyes opening wide. The king is knocking, wants to come inside. His heart is open, please, with love for you. What will you say? What will you do? What will you let him wrap in? Are you amazed? Do you not see? How deep are to me? Do you see my heart? Does it touch your heart? Shut up your fears apart. I don't believe that I can see God's face before me. God's face before me.
That beautiful God's Face by Father Stephen Howe. Yeah, gorgeous. I'll tell him you liked it. I'll tell him. He wrote that as a seminarian. He's ordained a priest in New York to this day. If you want to reach Father Stephen, or if you want to reach out to me. Sadly, there's not time right now for questions. I'm sure we could go on for hours into the night. But if anyone wants to reach out to me, happy to share my email address with you, or you can find me on Facebook at Andrew Dalton. But I think it's important now we have some time to prepare ourselves for Mass, and also the music ministry needs to probably get set up in here. So in just a few minutes, we'll begin for Mass. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for your interest and for being here today.
Thank you, Father Andrew, and there's another, I think you agree with me, another wonderful reflection on Lent, insightful reflection on Lent and the Passion. Thank you, Father. We're going to set up the altar. Give us 10 minutes and then we'll celebrate the Mass. Thank you.